In the history of American sports, Joe Montana is not just a name, but a standard. 4 Super Bowl championships, 3 times named MVP of the biggest game on the planet, 2 times NFL MVP, 8 Pro Bowl selections, and a career where every number carries the mark of cold perfection. In the most tense moments, when the entire stadium is roaring, when the clock has only a few seconds left, Joe Montana stood there as if time could not touch him. No panic, no wavering, no need for cheap heroic gestures, just a calm gaze, steady breathing, and a pass accurate to the point of ruthlessness. America called him Joe Cool, seeing him as the ideal image of masculine composure, winning in silence, leading without showmanship, and walking off the field with a calm demeanor as if victory were obvious. For many decades, his name was mentioned as the final answer to the question, who is the greatest quarterback of all time? But that very perfection, that invisible statue America built around Joe Montana, obscured a different truth, one quieter and more painful. Because behind the legend who never trembled was a man who had to live 2 parallel lives for 30 years. One life for the stands, for his teammates, for expectations that allowed no failure, and another life where he swallowed physical pain, hid the fear of being replaced, and carried the feeling that if he weakened for even a moment, everything would collapse. Joe Montana learned to smile when his body was falling apart, learned to lead when his heart was full of doubt, and learned to stay silent when no one allowed him to complain. His will did not lie in the trophies, but in his ability to stand firm while splitting himself in 2, one half living to fulfill the image of Joe Cool, the other half living quietly just to survive. And when his career ended, when there was no longer a field to hide behind, that pain did not disappear. It only revealed itself in the form of silence. Because for Joe Montana, silence was not avoidance, but the remaining trace of a will that had strained for too long to keep both lives from shattering. If you can feel the heavy silence behind the legendary image of Joe Montana, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue together on this journey of peeling back the real person behind the spotlight. Right after this, we will move on to the next part where childhood, trauma, and the tears swallowed inward began to form the Joe Cool that all of America once believed in. Joe Montana did not emerge from childhood with any halo or the belief that he was special. He emerged from a world where endurance was taken for granted, and emotions were something no one had time to touch. After the silent life that America only began to notice when he stepped away from the lights, everything has to go back to the beginning. A working-class family in Pennsylvania, where long days passed with sweat, discipline, and exhaustion, not with gentle conversations. In that house, no one intentionally hurt Joe, but no one had the leisure to ask how he was feeling either. His parents worked without rest, carrying on their shoulders the burden of putting food on the table, of responsibility, of having to survive in a society that showed no mercy to the weak. For them, love was shown by continuing to go to work every day, by never giving up, by teaching their children to stand firm against life. But in that way of loving, a child's emotions were pushed to the sidelines, not out of malice, but because there was no room left. Joe grew up amid hurried meals, quiet evenings, rooms where adults were too tired to listen, and children learned too early to understand that something was missing. No one asked, "Are you okay?" Because in that world, the question almost didn't exist. When Joe was sad, he learned to keep it to himself. When he was scared, he learned not to let it show. When he was in pain, he learned to grit his teeth and bear it. Not because he was taught that doing so was noble, but because he early understood there was no other choice. Crying didn't make the work lighter. Complaining didn't make the next day easier to breathe. And asking for help sometimes only added burden to others. So Joe Montana, from a very young age, began practicing living like an unwilling adult, learning to hide pain, not to cry, not to ask anyone for anything, Each time he swallowed his tears on his own, a very small part of him shrank, closed off more, but also grew tougher. The calm that people later praised was not a gift from heaven, but the product of years of telling himself he had to be okay, even when inside he was completely not okay. No one showed him how to speak his sadness, so he believed silence was the only way to survive. No one taught him that weakness is normal, so he believed weakness was something that had to be hidden. That very belief became the foundation for the man he would later become, both his strength and his burden. When Joe stepped onto the field, his composure reassured others, because it was built on years of self-control. But when Joe went home, when the lights went out, when no one needed him to be strong anymore, that silence did not just disappear on its own. It followed him like a habit etched into his bones. He was not used to talking about his fears, because he had never been asked. He was not used to sharing his exhaustion, because he had learned to endure it from before he was old enough to understand that you don't always have to hold it together like that. Throughout those years, Joe Montana built a shell of calm to protect himself from the world, but at the same time, unintentionally separated himself from the comfort that humans fundamentally need. That is the core tragedy in his story. The composure was not an innate talent that made him different, but the scar of a childhood where emotions had no place, where a child had to learn to swallow tears in order to keep walking. And that scar, even when covered by glory and victories, never truly disappeared. If the composure of Joe Montana was born from having to swallow tears too early, then his talent grew up in an even more painful paradox. The better he was, the more he felt guilty. From his early teenage years, Joe was clearly different from his peers. He ran faster, threw the ball more accurately, read the game better, and seemed to have an instinctive feel for sports that others had to train for years to even approach. On the baseball field, the basketball court, or the football field, Joe was always the one everyone's eyes followed, even though he himself never tried to make it that way. But instead of feeling proud, Joe learned to shrink himself. In an environment where he was already used to not drawing attention, standing out became a source of quiet stress. He was afraid of being seen too clearly, afraid of being pointed at, afraid of becoming the center of expectations he wasn't sure he could carry. When his friends celebrated victories, Joe felt a vague pressure weighing on his chest, as if every time he did better than others, he was pushing himself further away from the fragile safety he had tried to hold on to since childhood. Each compliment didn't bring a feeling of recognition, but rather a reminder that from now on, people would expect more from him. And Joe Montana, the boy who was used to no one asking, "Are you okay?" didn't know what to do with that expectation, except silently nod and tell himself he wasn't allowed to let them down. In his heart, talent wasn't a gift, but a debt that had to be repaid. The better he played, the more he felt he had to prove, had to maintain that image, had to live up to the role others had unintentionally assigned him. There were evenings when Joe lay in bed, his body exhausted after games, but his mind even more tired from unanswered questions. What if one day I play badly? What if I'm no longer the best? What if all of this is just temporary luck? Those questions were never spoken aloud, because Joe was too used to keeping everything to himself. He feared attention not because of a lack of outward confidence, but because deep inside he had never believed he deserved the spotlight. Talent came early, but belief in himself did not. Each time he was praised, Joe didn't feel better. He only felt like he was standing before a taller cliff, where one slip would send him falling. So instead of enjoying the small successes of youth, he lived in a constant state of defense, always mentally preparing for the day everyone realized he wasn't as perfect as they thought. That very fear forged in him an astonishing focus and a discipline almost ruthless toward himself. Joe practiced not to be celebrated, but to avoid mistakes. He played not to shine, but to not disappoint anyone. In the eyes of outsiders, that was the quality of a model athlete. But in Joe Montana's inner world, It was an endless escape from the feeling that he was never good enough. When others saw a promising young man, Joe only saw a child trying to keep his balance on a thin tightrope between expectation and fear. And the further he went in sports, the deeper that paradox became. Talent lifted him higher, but each step up brought a new burden. He didn't allow himself to feel proud for too long, didn't allow himself to believe in success, because in his subconscious, he always carried the feeling that everything could disappear at any moment. Success came early, opening the door to the brilliant future that America would later praise. But belief in himself remained forever outside that door, never stepping in. And it was from that absence of self-belief that Joe Montana kept moving forward, not as someone arrogant about his talent, but as a person carrying an invisible burden, trying to live in a way worthy of others' gaze, even though he never truly believed he was worthy of his own. When Joe Montana set foot at the University of Notre Dame, he did not just step into a college football team, he stepped into an icon. Notre Dame was not merely a place that trained athletes, it was a cathedral of American memory, where history, tradition, and Catholic faith blended into an invisible but suffocating pressure. There, every game was not just about winning or losing, but about the honor of an entire community. Every pass was not measured only in yards, but in the faith of millions who had learned to love football as part of their identity. For Joe Montana, the boy already used to hiding emotions and fearing standing out, Notre Dame was like a room flooded with lights, no dark corner to hide in. From the very first day, he understood that he was no longer the talented high school kid from a small town, but a representative of decades-long history. At Notre Dame, every mistake carried a moral tint, not just a technical error, but a sin. A bad pass could be seen as betraying trust. A decision half a beat slow could be scrutinized as unacceptable weakness. In that atmosphere, Joe learned a new lesson harsher than anything he had ever known. Never show hesitation, because hesitation is the first crack toward collapse. He trained with an intensity he himself dared not name, not to shine, but to avoid mistakes. Practices that dragged on until his body went numb, nights rewatching film until his eyes burned, all aimed at one single goal: do not let Notre Dame down. But in that very effort, another pain began to form an invisible, smoldering, and enduring suffering. Injuries were not rare in college football, but for Joe, they carried a different meaning. When his shoulder ached, when his knees throbbed, when his back stiffened after hits, he did not think about resting. He thought about the stands, about the icon, about the faith he was carrying. Taking the field was no longer a choice, but a duty. And so, Joe Montana began living two parallel lives, separate yet tightly bound. One life for the stands where he stood tall, calm, leading, where his gaze was not allowed to waver even with tens of thousands watching. The other life took place in the dark room, where he quietly iced injuries, gritted his teeth through pain, wondering whether his body could hold up for one more week. There were no cheers, no banners, only lingering pain and the silence he had known since childhood. Notre Dame taught Joe how to win under pressure, but it also unintentionally reinforced the belief that pain was something that had to be hidden. He was not encouraged to talk about the fear of more serious injury, not allowed to admit that there were mornings he woke up unsure if he had the strength to take the field. Because at Notre Dame, such an admission meant being unworthy, and Joe, who always feared negative attention, chose the only way he knew: silence, and keep going. His moments of brilliance, the comebacks, the game-deciding passes, were etched into fans' memories as proof of his grit. But behind each of those moments was a price no one saw: the accumulating exhaustion, the growing fear of failure, and the feeling that if one day he could not meet expectations, everything would collapse. At Notre Dame, Joe Montana did not just learn how to play elite football, he learned how to split himself in two. One half was allowed to appear, allowed to win, allowed to represent history and faith. The other half was locked in silence, where physical pain and mental unease dragged on without end. It was here, before the NFL called his name, before America called him Joe Cool, that Joe Montana perfected the skill of living two lives, one for the world to see, one for himself to endure. And that burden, placed on his shoulders in college, would never leave him when he stepped onto bigger, brighter, but also more ruthless stages. When Joe Montana entered the NFL, he did not just transition from college football to professional football, he stepped into a world where every gaze was sharper and colder, where mistakes were no longer seen as lessons, but as verdicts, where weakness was not viewed as human, but as something that needed to be replaced immediately. For Joe Montana, who already carried the weight of Notre Dame on his shoulders, the NFL was not a liberating leap forward, but a place where all the old pressures were magnified many times over. The media quickly recognized what set him apart. Not the beautiful passes, not the statistics, but the almost emotionless calm in moments when others would collapse. When teammates panicked, Joe stood still. When the stands roared, he did not change his breathing. When the game was pushed to the edge of chaos, he became the most dangerous. And so the nickname Joe Cool was born, repeated on newspaper pages, on television, in commentary rooms as absolute praise. America loved that image because it reflected their deepest ideal, the man who does not tremble under pressure, the leader who does not need to shout, the winner who does not need to show off. But Joe Montana understood better than anyone that that image was not the complete person he was. It was a mask, and once put on, he was not allowed to take it off. In the NFL, a single trembling hand was enough to lose your position. A wavering glance was enough to raise doubts. A bad game was enough for the media to turn its back. Joe understood that very early, even before he had time to enjoy reaching the biggest stage of his life. If I tremble, everything will collapse. Not just the team, not just the career, but the image that America had already begun to attach to him. And so Joe Cool was no longer a harmless nickname. It became a duty. He stepped onto the field each week, not only with the responsibility to play well, but with the responsibility to keep an entire story from breaking. Every game was a performance where he had to fully play the role of the fearless one, even when inside him was a silent storm of doubt and pain. Minor injuries were ignored. Lingering pains were compressed behind a calm smile. Sleepless nights from aching body were hidden behind short answers to the press. The media saw Joe Cool as a gift, but Joe Montana knew it was the result of a lifetime learning to suppress. He did not allow himself to get angry, because anger would be seen as loss of control. He did not allow himself to be sad, because sadness would be seen as weakness. He did not allow himself to panic, because panic would make others lose faith. And faith, in the NFL, was the only thing that kept a quarterback in place. So the mask stuck tighter to his skin, becoming more and more perfect, harder and harder to remove. People praised Joe Montana for his ability to stay calm in the final minutes, but no one asked how much he had to pay to maintain that calm. Each time he stepped into the huddle, he carried not only strategy, but also the fear that if he failed this time, the Joe Cool image would crack, and then he would have no place left. For Joe, the NFL was not just a battle against opponents, but a constant battle against himself, keeping the exterior steady while the interior was not allowed to collapse. Joe Cool, therefore, was not a glorious title. It was the survival mask of a man not allowed to be weak, forged from years of swallowing tears, from the fear of being seen too clearly, and from the ruthless understanding that at the pinnacle of American sports, one small crack was all it took for the whole world to turn away. And Joe Montana kept walking, with that mask on his face, not because he wanted to be worshipped, but because he knew that if he took it off, everything he had built would collapse right before his eyes. Joe Montana entered this phase of his life like a man who had perfected the mask to the point where even he himself struggled to distinguish where his skin ended and the shield began. On the outside, everything about him was neat to the point of coldness. Perfect numbers, precise plays, decisive moments without a tremble. The media saw a quarterback without mistakes. Teammates saw a leader who could make the entire huddle fall silent again just by standing still. Fans saw an icon of absolute control. In that world, Joe Montana seemed unaware of panic, had no bad days, and the concept of losing form did not exist. He stepped onto the field as if everything had already been calculated in advance, as if emotions were a luxury he had never needed. But that was only the outer life, the life designed for others to see and believe in. Joe Montana's inner life was a completely different space, where coldness was not strength, but the only way not to collapse. Inside that space, his body had never truly been at peace. The impacts accumulated from game after game, the lingering pains in his back, shoulders, knees, elbows, did not disappear when the final whistle blew. They followed him home, into fitful sleep, into mornings waking up, feeling his body aging faster than his years. But Joe did not talk about it. He could not, because a quarterback who admits pain is a quarterback who starts to be doubted. And in the NFL, doubt is the beginning of being replaced. That obsession clung to Joe Montana like a long shadow that never left. Not the fear of losing games, but the fear that one day, someone younger, healthier, labeled the future of the team, would rise up and make him redundant. He understood very well the ruthless rule of this league. No one is replaced because they are bad. They are replaced because someone else is thought to be better. And so in every game, Joe did not just play to win, but played to prove he was still necessary. Every accurate pass was not just points, but a silent plea. Don't leave me behind. That fear was not allowed to show on the outside, because if it did, the Joe Cool image would collapse. So he continued living two parallel lives, growing further and further apart. The outer life demanded that he be cold, precise, flawless. The inner life was filled with unanswered questions. What if one day I can't play like this anymore? What if one day my body betrays me? What if everyone only loves me because I'm useful? That was America's greatest fear wrapped up in one man, becoming useless. For Joe Montana, that fear did not take a dramatic form. It did not cause him to panic publicly, did not push him into outbursts of anger. It was quieter, more dangerous. It made him push himself beyond limits, made him train not to get better, but to not get worse. It made him view every compliment with caution, because today's praise could become tomorrow's standard used to judge him. It made him never allow himself to fully relax, even in moments of victory. When teammates celebrated, Joe was often the calmest, as if he could already see behind that joy a new cycle of pressure waiting. That was his double life. On the outside, a man America trusted absolutely. On the inside, a human being always living with the feeling he could be replaced at any moment. That contradiction gradually wore him down, not in a loud way, but in a silent and persistent one. He did not allow himself to be weak, because weakness meant losing value. He did not allow himself to slow down, because slowing down meant being left behind. And so, Joe Montana kept moving forward, carrying a painful body and a tense mind, keeping the outer image from ever cracking. Few people knew that every time he stepped onto the field with that calm appearance, inside was an unending negotiation between will and fear. Will told him he had to stand firm, had to lead, had to be the anchor for everyone. Fear whispered that if he slowed down for just one moment, everything would end. And Joe, the one who had learned to swallow tears since childhood, chose the only way he knew: silence, and keep going. No one asked him if he was tired. No one asked him how much longer he could endure, Because America is not used to asking those questions of its legends, people are only used to believing they are always strong. It was in that empty space that the tragedy of Joe Montana fully took shape. A man praised for perfection, but living with the constant fear that his value only existed as long as he remained useful. And that fear, no matter how well hidden, was still the deepest crack in the double life he had to carry for decades. Super Bowl, in America's memory, is where every dream comes true. It is the ultimate peak, the moment when all previous pain is supposed to have been worth it, the stage where the winner steps out as someone set free. But for Joe Montana, the Super Bowl was never the end. It was the beginning of another cycle, one heavier, lonelier, and more ruthless. 4 times reaching the absolute top of the NFL, 4 Lombardi trophies, 3 Super Bowl MVP awards, numbers sufficient to etch his name into history as something obvious. People looked at them and saw perfection, saw destiny, saw a man born to win. But people did not see what Joe Montana felt in those very moments. Victory did not bring the relief he once hoped for. It did not close the worry. It opened a new burden. Each Super Bowl won was not a period at the end of the pressure, but a reminder that from now on, he was not allowed to fall below his own standard. When the final whistle blew, when confetti fell, when teammates screamed in joy, Joe Montana was often the calmest person on the field. Not because he was not happy, but because he understood very clearly that that feeling was not allowed to last. Celebrating too long meant letting down your guard. Relaxing too soon meant falling behind. In his world, victory was only a temporary state before the next cycle of pressure began. The day after, while the media was still talking about the historic throw, Joe was already thinking about the next season. When people called him a legend, he wondered how long he could hold that position. The Super Bowl turned him into an icon, but it also turned him into a prisoner of that very icon. A legend is not allowed to be tired. A legend is not allowed to let go. A legend is not allowed to have a bad day. Joe Montana understood that just one Super Bowl that did not meet expectations would change the story. Just one loss at the wrong moment would turn praise into questions. And so, even in his most brilliant years, he never truly got to rest. His body carried the marks of every season, every hit, every time he pushed himself beyond limits, but instead of allowing himself to slow down, Joe forced himself to maintain absolute precision, because he knew that at the top, fatigue was not considered a valid excuse. It was only a sign of decline. Each Super Bowl MVP, in the public eye, was proof of his iron will. In Joe's inner world, it was a reminder that he had to keep playing this role, not allowed to slip from the Joe Cool image the whole country had grown accustomed to. Victory did not grant him the right to be an ordinary human. It took that right away. He was not allowed to celebrate for long, because celebrating meant forgetting the fear of being replaced. He was not allowed to be tired, because tiredness did not exist in the dictionary of legends. He was not allowed to let go, because letting go meant losing everything he had painstakingly built. And so each Lombardi trophy became another brick, building the wall around his life higher. That wall separated Joe Montana from the outside world, but it also separated him from the very relief he quietly longed for. People often say, victory heals all wounds. For Joe, it only wrapped the wounds more tightly, more deeply, harder to reach. The nights after the Super Bowl, when the noise had died down, when the hotel room was left only with silence, Joe Montana did not feel complete the way people imagined. He felt a strange emptiness, as if he had just completed a heavier duty rather than reached a dream. He had won, but at the same time, he had locked himself into a new standard that no one else could carry for him. Victory prolonged suffering in a very subtle way. It made everyone believe he had no reason left to complain, and when a person is no longer allowed to complain, their pain becomes invisible. For Joe Montana, The Super Bowl was not the destination of liberation. It was the machine that multiplied expectations, where every new glory demanded he sacrifice another piece of his real self. While the whole of America honored him as the icon of composure and victory, Joe kept walking on a journey where the destination always receded one more step. And that is the deepest tragedy of this legend. Victory does not end suffering. It only prolongs it more subtly, more silently, until even the winner no longer knows what he is running toward, other than continuing to run, so he is not left behind. After the trophies and the Super Bowl nights that never truly closed the door on worry, Joe Montana's body began to speak in a way he could no longer ignore. American football does not just take youth. It collects its debt in every joint, every muscle fiber, every lingering pain that eventually becomes habit. For Joe, the peak years did not pass like a straight, brilliant line, but like a continuous chain of collisions, where each game left a small mark that gradually accumulated into a map of pain across his body. Surgery became part of a life he never wanted to admit to. Not once, not a single injury, but multiple interventions, one after another. Enough to make any ordinary man stop and ask whether the price was too high. Painkillers appeared not as a solution, but as a temporary bridge to keep him moving forward. The pills helped him get up, helped him throw the ball, helped him smile in front of the media, but they also muffled the signals his body was sending, that it was time to slow down. There were mornings when Joe woke up and realized he could not tie his own shoelaces. Movements that seemed simple became painfully difficult, humiliating for a man once seen as the icon of control. He would sit there, bending over, feeling the pain spread from his back down his legs, and in a very brief moment, he wondered if he was fooling everyone, including himself. But that moment did not last. It was not allowed to last, because just a few hours later, he would step onto the field again as if he had never fallen apart. The crowd never saw those mornings. The media never heard the groans in the locker room. Teammates only saw the familiar Joe Montana, calm, precise, unflinching. And that is the classic tragedy of American sports, where the body breaks down, but the image must remain standing. Here, pain is treated as part of an invisible contract, something people expect stars to accept if they want to keep being celebrated. Joe understood that all too well. He knew that if he admitted his body could no longer keep up, the story would immediately change. The legend would become a question mark. Faith would turn into doubt. And so, he kept living two lives. One life where his body sent increasingly clear warning signals, and one life where he had to pretend everything was still fine. Surgery did not bring release. It only extended his ability to endure. Painkillers did not heal. They only helped him get through one more game. And each time he pushed through, Joe moved one step deeper into the dangerous gray area between resilience and self-destruction. He was not unaware of it, but in the world he lived in, the choice to stop almost did not exist. A quarterback is loved for his ability to endure. A legend is honored for never quitting, and Joe Montana, who had learned to swallow tears since he was a child, knew no other way than to keep going. Practices took place with a caution only he understood. Games were played with calculations not just about strategy, but about how much longer his body could hold out. He began to know a very specific kind of fear. Not fear of opponents, but fear that one day his body would refuse to obey his will. And if that day came, everything would end in a way he could not control. But even that fear was not allowed to show, because if it did, the Joe Cool mask would crack, and with it, the faith of the entire team. So Joe kept taking the field as if he had never shattered, kept throwing the ball as if those mornings when he could not tie his shoelaces had never happened. The stands cheered for that composure, unaware that it was bought with every smoldering ache. This is not just the story of Joe Montana. This is the classic tragedy of American sports, where people praise willpower but rarely look straight at its cost, where the image must stand firm even when the body has already begun to collapse. And Joe, with all his familiar silence, kept carrying that tragedy alone, because he believed that was what a legend was expected to do. When the physical pains had become a familiar part of life, Joe Montana began to face a different fear, one deeper and harder to name: the fear of not being a good enough father. Before that, every pressure in his life had a clear shape: a game to win, a season to stay in form, an image to protect. But when children entered his life, Joe realized there was a role he could not handle with the composure learned on the football field. Being a father is not like being a quarterback. There is no perfect strategy, no scoreboard, no final moments to fix mistakes. And that is what made him panic in a way no Super Bowl ever had. Joe feared that his children would grow up remembering him the way millions of other Americans did, through the TV screen, through endless highlight reels, through the image of a calm man in uniform, but a stranger in everyday life. He feared they would know Joe Montana before they knew Dad, feared that they would learn to be silent like him, growing up in a home where emotions were kept inside, where the father was physically present but mentally absent. Those fears did not come from nowhere. They were fed by Joe's own childhood, by memories of a family where adults worked without rest, where love existed but was rarely spoken. Joe did not blame his parents. He understood they had done everything they could, but understanding does not mean not carrying the scars. And when looking at his children, Joe began to wonder if he was unconsciously repeating that pattern. There were evenings when he came home after a game, body aching, mind still stuck on the field, and he realized he did not have the strength to listen to a small story from his child. He would sit there, silent, just like the adults had once sat when he was a boy. That moment frightened Joe Montana more than any hit, because for the first time in his life, he felt he could fail in a way that could not be fixed with effort or discipline. For the first time, a question appeared in his head with no clear answer. If I don't win, am I still worthy of being a father? In the world Joe Montana existed in, value was always tied to performance. You have value because you win, because you are useful, because you do not let anyone down. And even though Joe had reached the pinnacle of every measure, that core belief had never left him. So he began to fear that if one day he was no longer the winner on the field, he would also no longer be worthy in the eyes of the most important people. That is a very American fear, very quiet, but ruthless. The fear that love is also conditional. Family, which should be the place of absolute safety, instead became a mirror reflecting the cracks Joe had hidden for years. He realized that the Joe Cool mask, the one that had once helped him survive in the NFL, no longer worked in the family living room. There, silence was not seen as strength. It was felt as distance. And that distance hurt him in a way completely different from physical pain. Joe began trying to be more present, not as a legend, but as a father relearning basic things he had never been taught. But that process was not easy at all. There were times he did not know what to say, did not know how to ask, "Are you okay?" a question he had never heard himself. There were times he chose silence because he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of hurting, afraid of revealing his own clumsiness. And in those moments, Joe Montana felt more fragile than ever. He had faced hundreds of thousands of fans, massive and ruthless opponents, but in front of his children's eyes, he felt small. Family exposed the cracks that his career had hidden for too long. Joe did not just fear losing games, he feared not being enough, not close enough, not warm enough, not present enough. And that fear did not disappear when he won. It only quieted temporarily, then rose stronger in the quiet moments. Being a father forced Joe Montana to look straight at the question he had avoided his whole life. Where does a man's value lie when he is no longer winning? And even though he had not found a complete answer, the very act of daring to face that question marked a quiet turning point in his double life. Because for the first time, Joe Montana was not just fighting to preserve an image, but to not lose the only connection that could exist without needing victory. When Joe Montana retired, there was no loud collapse, no tears in front of the cameras, no dramatic statement, no sense of tragedy like people often attach to legends stepping off the stage. Just a very long, very deep, and very strange silence. The football field disappeared from his life faster than he expected. Mornings with no practice schedule, no strategies to study, no one waiting for him to lead. The cheers that had surrounded his life for decades suddenly stopped, leaving an emptiness that Joe Montana had never been prepared to face. Throughout his career, he always knew who he was when he stepped onto the field. Quarterback, leader, the one who had to stay calm so everything did not fall apart. But when the field was gone, that role vanished too. And for the first time in his adult life, Joe Montana woke up not knowing exactly who he needed to be that day. The double life he had maintained for 30 years began to collapse not because of a big event, but because it no longer had a reason to exist. The Joe Cool mask, once a survival tool, became meaningless in a world without an audience. But the real person behind that mask had never been fully nurtured to stand on his own. Joe was not used to not being judged by performance. He was not used to his value not being measured by wins, by statistics, by decisive moments. In the NFL, everything was clear. Win or lose, good or bad, necessary or replaceable. Outside the NFL, those boundaries blurred to the point of making him unsettled. There were days when Joe sat in the quiet house, listening to the wind through the window, and felt a lostness that no trophy had ever brought. No one called him to discuss strategy. No one needed him to stay calm. No one waited for him to fix others' mistakes. And in that quiet, Joe Montana began to realize a painful truth. For many years, he had lived to fulfill a role, not to understand himself. When the mask came off, what was revealed was not a person immediately free, but a man fumbling to learn how to exist without a ready script. He did not fall into crisis the way stories are often told about former athletes. No scandals, no excesses, no self-destructive decisions, but that very calmness hid a quiet psychological break. Joe Montana did not know where to put his pain when he was no longer allowed to turn it into motivation for competition. The physical pains were still there, reminding him of a life that had passed, but now with no clear purpose left to endure them. The old habits remained: waking up early, strict discipline, forcing himself to be okay. But there were no more games to prove that discipline meant something. Family saw Joe at home more, but also noticed he was in an unfamiliar state. He was present, but not completely at ease. He listened, but sometimes his gaze drifted away, as if searching for an invisible field. Being a father, being a husband in this phase, was no longer a sudden fear like before, but a prolonged challenge: how to exist without needing to win. Joe Montana had grown used to living two separate lives, one for the world, one for himself. But when the world no longer needed him in the old way, those two lives collided, exposing gaps he had never had the chance to fill. He realized he had been very good at enduring, but clumsy at living lightly. He knew how to lead an entire team, but was unsure how to lead himself through an afternoon with no schedule. This was Joe Montana's psychological break. Not a spectacular collapse, but a prolonged emptiness where all the old survival tools no longer worked. The double life collapsed without leaving visible rubble, but left a man who had to learn from scratch how to be present without a mask. And that process did not happen quickly or smoothly. It required Joe to accept that his real self had never been allowed to grow fully, because his whole life he had to play the role of someone not allowed to be weak. When the field disappeared, Joe Montana did not lose his fame. He lost the structure that had held up his entire identity, and in the long silence after retirement, he began a journey harder than any Super Bowl, learning to exist without needing to prove himself, learning to have value without winning, and learning to accept that sometimes the strongest thing is not continuing to tense up, but admitting that you are lost. This was not the end of the tragedy, but the moment the tragedy changed shape. From visible pressure on the grass, it turned into an invisible emptiness in everyday life. And Joe Montana, the man who once made all of America hold its breath, now had to learn to breathe for himself, in a world without cheers to cover the unease inside. After retirement, Joe Montana's life did not fall into a loud abyss like people often imagine for legends stepping down from the peak. No sensational headlines, no public crisis, no images of decline that make the public pity or judge. Everything happened much more quietly, and that very quietness was what hurt. The emptiness appeared not like a fall, but like a very ordinary morning when he woke up and did not know what he needed to do next. No field to prepare for, no teammates to lead, no schedule to count down to, just a new day opening up, vast to the point of frightening, and Joe Montana standing before it with a sense of lostness he had never experienced during his career. In the NFL, every day had a clear purpose. Outside the NFL, purpose became vague to the point of tiring him in a different way. Joe did not collapse in an explosive way, because he had never been allowed to do that. Instead, he continued the old, disciplined routine, waking up on time, training moderately, keeping his body stable. But behind those habits was a repeating question he did not voice. What am I living for? Days passed without marking events, without calls of his name from the stands, without moments when someone needed him to make a decision. Joe Montana, who had once been the center of every tense situation, now had to face a new kind of pressure, the pressure of being invisible. There were afternoons when he sat in the quiet house, listening to the clock tick, and realized no one was waiting for him anywhere. Not because he was forgotten, but because the role that had defined him no longer existed. Evenings came slower, longer, and emptier. No more strategy calls, no more rushed interviews, no more feeling that if he did not speak up, everything would fall apart. Instead, quiet dinners where his voice was no longer required. And in that quiet, Joe Montana clearly felt a pain very hard to name. Pain from no longer being needed in the old way. He was not sad in a dramatic way, did not complain to anyone, because he had learned not to do that since childhood. But that very lack of complaining made the pain deeper. This is a very American tragedy, suffering without being allowed to complain. A society that honors those who stand alone, those who do not grumble, those who are okay even when they are not. Joe Montana fit that image perfectly, to the point that when he truly needed to be heard, he did not know where to start. Family was there, but Joe did not want to become an emotional burden. Friends respected him, but no one thought a legend like that could feel empty. And so he kept silent, kept living with an emptiness no one witnessed. Days of not knowing what to wake up for followed one another, not because he was lazy or completely lost direction, but because he was losing the thing that had given him the clearest reason to exist. On the field, every moment had meaning. Off the field, meaning became something he had to search for himself, and Joe had never been taught how to do that. He was used to his value being confirmed immediately through wins, through cheers, through the trusting eyes of teammates. Now that value was no longer reflected from the outside, and he had to face a long silence where no one clapped, no one called his name. It was not complete loneliness, but the feeling of being suspended between a glorious past and a vague present. Joe Montana did not lose himself in a dramatic way. He lost the familiar rhythm of life, and with it, the certainty that had supported him for years. In the rare moments he allowed himself to be honest, he realized he had prepared for every situation on the grass, but had not prepared for life after the grass disappeared. And so he kept living through the quiet days, carrying a pain no one saw, no one asked about, and no one expected him to express. American-style suffering does not need tears, does not need cries. It exists in silence, seen as dignity. And Joe Montana, the man once honored for his composure, now had to carry that very composure like a burden, in an emptiness that only he knew how deep it truly was. After the long days passing in an emptiness no one witnessed, Joe Montana gradually entered a different phase of his life, not through a clear decision, but through a fatigue big enough to make him stop resisting. He did not wake up one morning and say he had found new meaning. No moment of enlightenment, no promises to himself. Just one day, he realized he no longer had the energy to keep living, as if every day were a game he had to win. And that was the first time in his life Joe Montana allowed himself to slow down. Family became the center in a very different way than before. No longer the fear of being judged, no longer the question, am I still worthy? Just simple meals, quiet afternoons, conversations without a specific purpose. He began to be more present, not as a man trying to make up for something, but as someone learning how to stay still in the moment. The slow pace at first made him uncomfortable. The silence that had once been an enemy now became something he had to get used to. No packed schedule, no pressure to always be ready. And in that emptiness, Joe Montana felt a very fragile relief, accompanied by the unease that, if he no longer fought, he would become invisible. But then, little by little, he realized that not needing to prove himself did not mean having no value. Family did not love him for the trophies. His children did not need him to win to call him dad. That simple truth, which sounds obvious to many people, was something Joe had to learn later than most. He began allowing himself to do things that did not produce clear results. Walking with no goal, sitting still without feeling guilty, ending a day without asking himself if he had been good enough. But this was not healing in the complete sense. The old scars did not disappear. The fear of becoming useless was still there, just no longer dominating every thought. Joe Montana did not become a completely different person. He only learned how to exist without needing to win. And for someone who had lived his whole life in the win-lose logic, that was a bigger change than any tactical adjustment he had ever made on the field. There were days he still woke up with a feeling of emptiness, still missed the old rhythm, still craved the feeling of being needed. But instead of forcing himself to fill that emptiness with achievements, he learned to let it exist. He learned to accept that there are questions that do not need immediate answers, that life after glory does not always have clear structure. Family, with all its ordinariness, became the only anchor that did not demand he be anyone other than himself. The slow pace did not turn him into someone radiantly happy, but it gave him something he had never had: space to breathe without feeling ashamed. Joe Montana began to understand that his whole life he had been fighting not just opponents, but the idea that value must always be proven. Letting go of that idea did not make him weaker, but it also did not make him stronger in the familiar way. It just made him more human. And that was a feeling both comforting and frightening. Late acceptance does not bring complete release. It does not erase the years that passed, does not return the parts of himself sacrificed for the image and expectations, but it allowed Joe Montana to keep living without having to tense up every day. He no longer fought to hold his position, no longer had to be cold to survive. He just existed slowly, sometimes lost, sometimes at peace, in a life that no longer demanded he win to stay. And for someone who once made all of America hold its breath, learning to live without having to fight was perhaps the final match the hardest, and also the quietest one he had ever gone through. After learning to live more slowly, learning to exist without needing victory, Joe Montana thought the biggest battles of his life were behind him. He no longer had to tense up in front of the stands, no longer had to maintain an image for America, no longer had to prove his worth through decisive moments. But then, in 2020, an event occurred that made all the shells he had built fall away in an instant. A home intrusion right in his own house. No football field, no teammates, no strategy, no roaring crowd, just family and a real threat. So close, there was no room for thinking or control. In that moment, Joe Montana was no longer Joe Cool. He was not calm. He did not calculate. He did not stand outside, observing. All that existed was the primal instinct of a man seeing his own flesh and blood in danger. Not an NFL legend, not an icon of composure. Just a father, a grandfather, ready to trade everything to protect the people he loved. The noteworthy part is not in the details of the incident, but in that immediate reflex. His whole life, Joe Montana had learned to control, learned to stay calm, learned not to let emotions show. But in the moment his family was threatened, all those skills became meaningless. He did not need them. He did not want them. What rose up was an instinct he had unintentionally suppressed for years: protection. This was the rare time in his life when Joe did not fear losing his image, did not fear failure, did not fear judgment. The only fear that existed was the fear of losing loved ones, and that very fear made him more resolute than any Super Bowl. After the incident, Joe Montana did not say much. He did not turn it into a media story, did not use it to reinforce a heroic image, because this was not a victory to celebrate. This was the moment that exposed the real person he had never allowed himself to be in public. A person not cold, not precise, not in absolute control, but full of emotion, full of fear, and full of love. That intrusion did not make him stronger in the familiar sense. It did not bring titles, did not bring recognition, but it clarified something that for decades Joe Montana had never dared admit. His real self had never been on the football field. It had always been in the moments he was ready to set himself aside to protect others. When the danger passed, when everything returned to quiet, Joe Montana did not go back to being a legend. He went back to being an ordinary man, with heavier breathing, with trembling he no longer tried to hide. And for the first time, he did not feel ashamed of it, because in this final incident, he did not need to win. He only needed his family to be safe. And perhaps that was the only moment in his life when Joe Montana no longer lived two parallel lives. No mask, no role, just a man who had gone through both glory and emptiness, and finally understood that the most worth protecting had never been the image, but the lives sleeping peacefully in his own home. After the incident in 2020, when his true instinct had surfaced and every mask was no longer necessary, Joe Montana's legacy appeared in a way completely different from what America had been used to seeing. No longer just the cold numbers, no longer only the 4 Lombardi trophies or the breath-holding moments in the Super Bowl. That legacy, when looked at long enough and close enough, was paid for with pain. Not explosive pain for people to pity, but enduring pain, persistent, prolonged, silent, eating deep into every habit of living, every breath, every choice not allowed to be wrong. 30 years of endurance, not enduring one season, one injury, or one difficult period, but enduring an entire lifetime of expectations. 30 years not allowed to be weak, not allowed to be tired, not allowed to stop and ask himself if he was still okay. 30 years living for the expectations of others, for the faith of teammates, for the story America needed to believe that composure could conquer any chaos. People call that glory. But for Joe Montana, it was a debt repaid day by day. His legacy was not built only with accurate passes, but with mornings so painful he could not tie his own shoelaces, yet still had to smile. Not only with perfect fourth quarters, but with sleepless nights haunted by the fear of being replaced. Not only with MVP titles, but with moments as a father, in the fear of repeating himself, fearing his children would grow up in silence the way he had grown up. That legacy is not glamorous when viewed from the inside. It is like a long road where every step forward was paid for by compressing another part of his real self deeper inside. Joe Montana did not become a legend because he did not know fear. He became a legend because he lived with fear for 30 years without letting it show. Honoring Joe Montana, if it stops only at the golden record of achievements, is a cruel simplification, because that ignores the price he paid to keep that record from collapsing. His true legacy lies in his ability to carry collective pressure without demanding sympathy, lies in becoming the anchor for an entire team, while having no anchor himself beyond discipline and silence, lies in accepting that the whole country loved an image, even though that image forced him to hide his most fragile parts. 30 years not allowed to be weak is not a heroic story. It is the tragic story of a culture that worships strength to the point of not knowing what to do with fragility. Joe Montana lived for the expectations of others so long that when the mask fell off, he had to relearn how to live for himself. And that very process, slow, clumsy, incomplete, makes his legacy more human than any legend. He did not leave a message that everyone must endure like him. He left a more uncomfortable question. What have we loved legends for the people they are, or their ability to hide pain well enough not to bother us? A legacy paid for with pain is not to glorify pain, but to remind that behind every icon is a person who sacrificed very real parts of themselves. When looking back at the entire journey, Joe Montana does not appear as a flawless god. He appears as a man who tensed up for too long and still stood firm, not because he did not hurt, but because he did not allow himself to fall. That legacy does not lie entirely in museums or highlight reels. It lies in the silence that lasted 30 years, a silence America had grown used to enjoying, but rarely asked about the cost. And if there is a way to truly honor that tragedy, it is to look straight at that cost, acknowledge it, and understand that this legend did not just win games, he survived a lifetime not allowed to be weak. And that, perhaps, is Joe Montana's most expensive victory. When looking back at the entire journey of Joe Montana, the final thing that needs to be said is not an exoneration, but an understanding. The double life he lived for 30 years was not a lie. It was never a calculated pretense to deceive the public or hide his true nature. It was the way a man learned to survive in a world that did not allow him to be fully himself. Joe Montana did not live falsely. He lived split in two by expectations. The expectations of teammates who needed a leader who did not tremble, the expectations of the media who needed an icon without cracks, the expectations of America who needed a story where grit always conquers fear. One half of him stepped into the light under the name Joe Cool Cold, Precise, Flawless. The other half was kept in the dark, where physical pain was not named, where the fear of being replaced was not acknowledged, where the question, "Do I still have value if I don't win?" echoed with no one to answer. For decades, those two halves coexisted not because he wanted them to, but because it was the only thing that kept him standing. When the field was still there, when the cheers still rang out, when the roll was still clear, that split was covered by glory. But when all those things disappeared, Joe Montana had to face the naked truth. He had lived for the expectations of others so long that his real self had never had the chance to grow fully. And it was in that moment that his story became beautiful in a painful way. The Joe Montana of today has no field to step onto, no stands holding their breath for every pass, no cheers to confirm that he is still needed. Instead, there is silence, but a silence completely different from before. No longer forced silence, silence for survival, silence to preserve an image. It is silence by choice. A silence where he does not need to prove himself, does not need to win, does not need to tense up to fit any mold. In that space, Joe Montana is no longer split between stage and backstage. He is simply a man carrying the memories of a lifetime of endurance, the brilliant victories, the lingering pains, the unspoken fears, and the family moments that made him realize what could never be traded. The double life ended not with a declaration, but with a late acceptance that he no longer needed to keep living as an icon. He could live as a human being. This story does not deny Joe Montana's glory. It places that glory in its proper context, as the visible tip of an iceberg supported by years of unseen endurance. When we talk about legends, we usually talk about moments of victory. But with Joe Montana, what made him a legend was not just what happened in 4 quarters. It was his ability to carry on his shoulders an entire culture that worships strength without collapsing. It was accepting being misunderstood, simplified, boxed into Joe Cool, in exchange for stability for the collective. It was surviving a lifetime not allowed to be weak, while still retaining enough humanity to love, enough to protect his family, enough to step away from the lights when the time came. And that very choice to withdraw quietly, without fanfare, was his final act of courage. Not the courage of a quarterback in the 2-minute drill, but the courage of a human being daring to live without needing applause. When the final image appears, there is no bright green field, no roaring crowd, no chants of his name. Just a man, standing in the silence he has reclaimed for himself, a silence no longer a forced hiding place, but a rare space of freedom after a lifetime of tensing up. And in that silence, Joe Montana's legacy does not fade. It becomes deeper, truer, and more human, because some legends are not created by victories, but by the years of endurance no one saw. Looking back at the entire story of Joe Montana, the feeling that remains is not simple admiration for a sports legend, but a deep sorrow for a human being who paid far too high a price to keep America believing in the image of Joe Cool. 4 Super Bowls, historic moments, and icy composure on the field were once seen as the pinnacle of grit. But through each part of the story, we clearly see that composure was not a gift, but the result of a childhood without space for emotions, of years having to swallow pain, hide fear, and not be allowed to be weak. The detail that Joe had to take painkillers, undergo repeated surgeries, yet still step onto the field as if he had never shattered, shows the classic tragedy of American sports. The image must stand firm, even when the person inside is collapsing. Even more painful was when he became a father, panicking for the first time, not over losing a game, but over the fear that his children would only remember him through TV, and the haunting question, if I don't win, am I still worthy of being a father? The moment of retirement, when there was no longer a field, no longer cheers, the double life collapsed to reveal a person who had not yet grown up outside the role of winner. And the intrusion incident in 2020, where there was no longer Joe Cool, but only a man ready to trade everything to protect his family, exposed the true instinct he had hidden his whole life. The lesson for Americans is not to be stronger, but to learn to allow people to be weak, to speak their pain before it becomes a burden lasting decades. Society honors success, but Joe Montana's story reminds us that human value should not be tied to victory, because some legends are not created by glory, but by the years of endurance no one saw. If the story of Joe Montana has touched you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a follow as thanks to the legends who endured in silence, so all of America could believe in strength. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the beautiful but painful stories behind the spotlight.